Why was she still alive? That question pulsed through the furnace air as Staff Sergeant Zoe Brooks knelt in the Sonoran desert, wrists zip-tied, skin blistering, lips cracked, and a wall of heat pressing down like punishment from a silent god. The cartel lieutenant thought it was over. He stood in front of her, sunglasses reflecting the endless sand, boots crunching as he kicked dust toward her face. "You Delta Force," he said in broken English, smirking. "So elite, yes, but elite needs water like everyone else." He leaned closer, his shadow slicing across her shoulders. "Let's see how tough you are after 3 days. Maybe you crawl back to us. Maybe you beg, maybe you just die." He laughed, sharp and cruel, the sound evaporating into the dry air as if even the desert refused to carry it. Then he turned, climbed into the truck and drove away, the sound of the engine fatting until nothing remained but wind and silence. The kind of silence that felt alive. Zoe waited, still, breathing shallow, watching the trail of dust drift across the horizon until it was gone. Then, only then, did she move. The zip ties were industrial grade, designed to restrain grown men. But Delta Force training didn't leave you unprepared for anything that could hold you. She twisted her wrists, rotated her shoulders back until the tendons in her arms screamed, and dislocated her left thumb with a small, practiced movement that sent a jolt of white pain up her arm. Her hand slipped free, slick with sweat. A second later, the tie snapped. She was free, but freedom meant nothing out here. Zoe stood, scanning the horizon with eyes trained to find pattern in chaos. The desert stretched infinitely, sand, scrub, shimmering heat, mountains in the far distance that looked close enough to reach but were at least 15 kilometers away. No water, no shade, no gear, no weapon. Her M4 carbine, sidearm, plate carrier, GPS all gone. They'd stripped her down to nothing. But Delta Force training had taught her something the lieutenant never would understand. You are never unarmed if you know your environment. She glanced at the sun, northwest sky, maybe 2 p.m. That gave her 5 hours before sunset, 8 before full dark. And 90 kilometers between her and the compound, where her team was being held. The heat hit like a physical force, the air shimmered, her tongue felt like dry paper. She closed her eyes, listening to the faint hum of insects, the distant caw of a crow, the whisper of wind against rock. Each sound told a story. Life existed here. And where there was life, there was water. She crouched beside a creosote bush. The plant's roots ran deep, sometimes reaching hidden moisture. She dug into the sand with her hands, slow, deliberate, until her fingers found damp earth. Not drinkable, not yet, but useful. She took off her uniform top, buried it in the cool sand, waited, then put it back on damp now, offering evaporative cooling. It dropped her body temperature by maybe 2 or 3 degrees. In the desert, that difference meant life. Still kneeling, she looked out toward the horizon. Somewhere beyond that line of heat shimmer was her team, captured, beaten, maybe still alive. She whispered, "Hold on." 6 hours earlier. The mission briefing had taken place in a nondescript building in El Paso, beige walls, flickering fluorescent lights, and an air conditioner fighting a losing battle against the desert heat outside. Agent Morrison, mid-40s, gray at the temples, had introduced himself with the kind of official vagueness that screamed DEA or Homeland Security. "The target is the Salazar cartel's distribution hub," he'd said, tapping a satellite image on the projector. 90 kilometers south of the border. They're moving $50 million of fentanyl every month through this location, enough to kill 10 million people. Lieutenant Colonel David Kine, the Delta team leader, leaned forward, eyes narrowing. "What makes this Delta Force priority, instead of DEA or Border Patrol?" Morrison didn't hesitate. 3 reasons. 1. The Salazar cartel has acquired military-grade weapons, M240s, grenade launchers, maybe even shoulder-fired missiles. 2, they're holding 3 American hostages. And 3, they've fortified their compound like a small base. Conventional assault would be suicide. So you need us to do the impossible, Zoe had said quietly from the second row. Her tone wasn't arrogant, just factual. She was 28, the youngest operator in the unit, and one of only 3 women to ever pass Delta selection, a process that broke 90% of those who tried. Morrison gave a humorless smile. Essentially, yes, surgical precision, minimal casualties, hostage rescue, drug interdiction, the kind of thing you were made for. Zoe studied the satellite imagery. The compound sat on high ground, surrounded by open desert. No cover, no concealment, no easy approach. "What's the water situation?" she asked. That earned her a few confused glances. Morrison clicked the slide. One well inside the compound. The surrounding desert is bone dry. Daytime temperatures reach 115 degrees. So their defense positions are tied to the well, she said. They can't patrol far without returning for hydration. Correct. Lieutenant Colonel Kine gave her a nod. He understood what that meant. They'd use the desert itself as an ally or an enemy. After the briefing, Zoe sat at the team table cleaning her rifle, each motion deliberate. Strip, inspect, oil, reassemble. It wasn't habit, it was meditation. Kine approached quietly. "You're worried about the desert." "I'm worried about everything," she said, eyes still on her weapon. "That's why I'm still breathing. But yes, the desert's a factor. No cover, high heat, limited water. If something goes wrong during approach, heat casualties will stack fast." "We're inserting at night," he said. "Sir, with respect, the Sonoran Desert at night is still 85 degrees. We'll be carrying 60 pounds of gear across soft sand. Even at night, dehydration hits hard." Kine watched her for a moment, then smiled faintly. "You grew up in Arizona, didn't you?" "Yes, sir, Phoenix. Learned to respect the desert early." "The desert isn't just terrain," she said softly. "It's an active threat. It kills people who underestimate it." "That's why you're on this team," Kine said. "Your survival instincts are what got you through selection. If things go sideways, use them." The insertion happened at 200 hours. 8 operators fast-roped into darkness 15 kilometers from the target compound. The desert swallowed them. Zoe moved point, her boots sinking into loose sand, the horizon glowing faintly under starlight. Even in darkness, the heat lingered 85 degrees, maybe more. Sweat rolled down her spine, soaking her undershirt. By 4:45, they'd reached their observation post overlooking the compound. Through her night scope, Zoe saw it clearly: high walls, searchlights, armed guards, 3 main structures, and an interior courtyard. "Sniper 1 in position," she whispered. "Copy," Kine's voice came through comms, calm and steady. "Hold, assault element moving." Everything was textbook. Wait for the guard change at 600, breach, extract hostages, exfil before sunrise. And then the desert reminded them who was in charge. At 5:37, a patrol appeared from a dry gully no satellite image had shown. They were too close. Avoiding contact was impossible. "Contact front." Gunfire shattered the silence, a strobe of light and thunder in the dark. Zoe fired precise and controlled, dropping the first 2 targets, but the rest scattered, returning fire. The compound exploded into chaos. Alarms blared. Floodlights snapped on, slicing across the desert floor. "Fall back," Kine ordered. But falling back meant crossing open terrain. No cover, no concealment. "Sniper 1, cover our withdrawal," came Kine's voice again. Zoe's M4 barked, muzzle flashes lighting her face. She moved positions constantly, using the small ridges in the sand for micro cover, but the cartel had numbers too many. They were flanking. "They're cutting off our route," Sergeant Jennifer Martinez shouted. Zoe saw it happening, the encirclement closing like a net. I'm going to draw their attention, she said into comms. Negative, Kine barked. We don't split. Sir, we're about to be overrun. Either I pull them or we all get captured. Before he could reply, she was moving. See you at Rally Point Charlie in 12 hours, she said. Zoe, that's 90 kilometers through hostile territory. Yes, sir, I'm aware. Her last burst of gunfire cracked the night, 2 enemies down, the rest turning toward her. She ran north, firing sporadically, making herself the loudest target in the desert. Behind her, Kine's voice came over comms one last time. All units withdraw. Zoe bought us time, don't waste it. The cartel chased her for hours. Engines roared. Headlights cut through the dark, sweeping across dunes and brush. Zoe ran until her lungs felt like sandpaper. She used terrain to her advantage, gullies, rock shadows, everything that broke the line of sight. For 3 hours she evaded them, until the trucks boxed her in. She fought until her rifle clicked empty, then until her sidearm jammed, then until they overwhelmed her by sheer numbers. A rifle butt to the head dropped her. When she woke, she was in the back of a truck, wrists zip-tied, blood dried on her lip, the night sky above her fading into orange dawn. The lieutenant leaned over her, smiling. You fight good, he said, but you die slow. He gestured to his men, stop here. They dragged her from the truck and dropped her onto burning sand. The lieutenant looked around, nothing but desert in every direction. 90 kilometers from my compound, he said. No water, no radio, no hope. He knelt beside her. Delta Force dies today. The desert will teach you humility. Then he climbed back into the truck and left. Now, hours later, Zoe stood where he'd abandoned her. The air wavered with heat. Her pulse slowed, her breathing steadied. They thought they'd buried her in nothingness, but the desert wasn't nothing, it was alive. And she understood it better than anyone. She turned east, toward the mountains, toward her team, toward the impossible. Every step forward would burn. Every breath would cost her water she didn't have. But she took that first step anyway. Because Zoe Brooks wasn't trained to survive. She was trained to adapt, to endure, to finish the mission, no matter how far, no matter how empty the horizon looked. And somewhere, deep beneath that silence, the desert itself seemed to whisper back. Let's see who quits first. What keeps a person moving when logic says stop? When the air itself feels like a weight pressing you down, and each breath tastes like dust and copper. For Zoe Brooks, the answer wasn't courage. It was duty. Duty has no temperature. The sun had already climbed high when she began walking east. The light was blinding, white, merciless. Heat shimmered across the dunes like ripples of glass. Her boots sank into sand that burned through the soles. Every few steps she glanced at the shadows, measuring their length, tracking time. A soldier's clock. She knew she could only move for about 5 hours before the heat became lethal. Her body was sweating faster than she could replace fluid, except she had no fluid to replace. So she changed strategy. She stopped every 20 minutes, crouched, slowed her breathing. The goal wasn't speed, it was endurance. By late afternoon, the world had narrowed to sound, the crunch of sand, the hiss of wind, the thump of her pulse inside her ears. Thoughts came in fragments. Northeast Ridge Line. Keep bearings, don't waste motion. They think you're dying. Good, let them think that. At 6 p.m., the sky softened to amber. Shadows grew long and forgiving. She dropped to her knees beside a low ridge of rock, dug her fingers into the cooler sand beneath, and smiled for the first time that day. The temperature was falling. She could move again. When the first star appeared, she looked up, Polaris, her compass. She adjusted her course slightly, east by southeast, and began walking again. Each star was a breadcrumb home. Hours passed. The desert transformed. What had been a furnace became an ocean of silver light. The wind picked up, carrying the faint scent of sage and dust. Somewhere far away, a coyote called. Zoe listened carefully. Wildlife meant life. Life meant water. She crouched, scanning the sand for movement. A line of tracks, jackrabbit fresh within an hour. Then others, smaller, almost parallel. Desert quail. They all moved in the same direction, toward a series of shallow hills about a kilometer away. She followed. When she reached the base of the hills, she found a dry wash cutting through the rock. The moonlight revealed faint moisture stains along the stone. Water had flowed here recently. She pressed her palm against the rock face. Cool, very cool. She dug with her hands, sand, pebbles, then dampness. She kept digging until a shallow pool began to collect. It wasn't much, half a cup maybe, but it shimmered under moonlight like salvation. She cupped it with both hands, sipped, waited, sipped again. It tasted of minerals and dust, but it was water. Life. She exhaled slowly, almost a laugh. "You're not getting me that easy," she whispered to the night. She rested there for a while, back against the rock, the stars spilling overhead. Sleep came in flickers, minutes at a time, broken by the cold. The desert that burned by day froze by night. Her damp uniform clung to her skin, now icy. She shivered but refused to move closer to the open sand where predators might silhouette her. Her mind drifted, not to fear but memory. Phoenix, age 9. Her father teaching her to track lizards through the backyard dust. "Don't look at the prints," he'd said. "Look between them, that's where the truth hides." Years later, Delta selection instructors had said almost the same thing about people. She smiled faintly. "Guess all training starts at home." When dawn painted the horizon red, she stood. Stiff joints, cracked lips, but alive. She started walking again before the sun cleared the mountains. The plan was simple: travel at night, rest in daylight, conserve water, move like a shadow. By mid-morning, she found a small canyon scattered with creosote bushes and saguaro skeletons. Perfect shelter. She dug a shallow trench beneath one of the bushes, lined it with damp sand, and lay inside. The air in that trench was 10 degrees cooler than the open desert. She slowed her heartbeat, focused on each breath. The mind is the real battlefield. Lose it and the body follows. But still, a whisper of doubt crept in. What if they're already dead? The thought struck like a bullet. She turned her head sharply as if shaking it out. No, Kine wouldn't let that happen. Martinez, Washington, they'd hold out. Yet part of her knew. The cartel didn't take prisoners for long. She closed her eyes. The face of the lieutenant flashed in memory, his grin, his arrogance. "You die slow," he'd said. "Not today." As the sun climbed, Zoe forced herself to stay still. Every instinct screamed to move, but movement meant dehydration. So she listened instead. The world around her was not empty. It was alive with hidden motion. A lizard scuttled past her boot. A hawk cried overhead. The desert was speaking if you knew its language. She thought about what Delta Force selection had really been. Not the miles of running, not the endless shooting drills. It was the silence. The nights when instructors left you alone in the wilderness with nothing but a map and said, "Find your way back." That was when you learned the truth. The enemy wasn't out there. It was the voice inside that whispered, "You can't." Zoe stared at the horizon. "You don't get to talk," she muttered to herself. Night came again, quick and absolute. She moved out, tracing the faint trail of the canyon animals. Each hour she covered about 5 kilometers, packing herself, marking landmarks in her mind. By midnight she was halfway to where she estimated the cartel compound to be. The moon was high when she stumbled across a patch of barrel cactus. She used a sharp fragment of flint she'd found earlier to slice into one. The pulp was bitter and slimy, but the moisture inside was enough to wet her throat. Every sip burned slightly. It contained alkaloids, but it kept her alive. She laughed softly between swallows. "Nature's version of whiskey," she said to the night. For a moment under that vast, endless sky, she didn't feel hunted or lost. She just felt human, one small pulse in a giant, indifferent world. Around 300 hours she saw lights, faint, flickering, distant. The compound. She crouched behind a rise, heart steady. Even from this distance she could see movement, trucks, guards patrolling with flashlights. Her team was in there somewhere. Still alive, maybe. She couldn't rush in. She needed information, timing, leverage. She would need another night, maybe two. She turned away, retreating into darkness before dawn betrayed her position. That next day tested everything she knew about endurance. The temperature hit 118 degrees. The air didn't move. Her skin peeled at the edges of her gloves. When she inhaled, her lungs burned. She forced herself to think clinically, checklist, not panic. Shade minimal. Hydration, ration cactus pulp. Mindset stable. Every few hours she muttered the mantra Delta instructors had drilled into her. Don't waste energy on emotion. Focus on the next right move. But emotion still leaked through. The guilt of leaving her team, the image of Martinez shouting, the sound of gunfire fatting behind her. It wasn't noise. It was memory replaying like a broken film. She pressed her palms to the sand until she felt the pain. Pain was grounding. Pain meant alive. At sunset she rose again. Her legs trembled. Her lips were bleeding. Yet when she looked east she smiled. The mountains were closer. The horizon wasn't endless anymore. That night she found a spring, barely a seep, just a trickle from rock. She filtered it through her shirt, let the drops fall into her cupped hands. The first taste made her throat spasm. The second steadied her. By the third she felt clarity return. She drank slowly, whispering, "Thank you," to no one in particular. It wasn't prayer, it was respect. As she sat under the stars, she began crafting. A soldier without tools becomes an engineer. She snapped dry cactus ribs into short lengths, sharpening them on stone until they became serviceable spikes. She braided strands of her torn uniform into cord. From a patch of creosote resin she scraped adhesive. Primitive weapons, yes, but in the right hands, primitive could be lethal. When the wind shifted, she caught the faint smell of fuel on the air. Diesel, the compound's generators. That meant she was within 40 kilometers now. She rested a moment, eyes closed. In her mind she heard Kine's voice. If things go sideways, use what you've got. She smiled. Roger that, sir. By dawn, the horizon blazed orange. She dug another shallow shelter beneath a sandstone overhang, shaded herself, and waited. The desert was quiet again, but now it felt different, less hostile, more like a partner that demanded respect. She begun to read it the way she read people. The signs, the rhythm, the moods. And for the first time since being left behind, she felt something strange stirring beneath exhaustion. Hoping. Not the loud kind that shouts. The quiet kind that breathes with you. She was still alone, still weaponless, still 90 kilometers from civilization, but she was no longer dying. She was adapting. And somewhere out there, her team was counting on her. The cartel lieutenant had wanted to make an example of Delta Force. He had. Just not the one he intended. Because Zoe Brooks was no longer surviving the desert. She was learning to use it. And the desert, relentless, ancient, unforgiving, was about to become her weapon. How far can one person push before the body breaks? Zoe Brooks was starting to find out. Her muscles felt carved from sand and wire. Her tongue stuck to the roof of her mouth. Her skin was tight, dry, cracking at the edges of her gloves. Every step burned, but every step also mattered. Because every step meant one thing: she hadn't stopped. By the fourth night, the desert no longer looked like a wasteland. It looked like a map. A breathing, shifting system she could read and use. When she crouched in the shadows of a ridge and stared across the shimmering expanse, the faint glow of the cartel compound pulsed on the horizon like a dying star. Still distant, still unreachable, but closer than it had been yesterday. She survived the first 72 hours, the point when most people would have collapsed or gone mad. Now it wasn't just about staying alive. It was about turning survival into strategy. She crouched beneath the partial shade of a broken saguaro. The ribs of the cactus, long, spined, and fibrous, were nature's bones. She ran her fingers along one, testing its strength, then snapped it against her knee. It broke clean. She shaped one end against a stone until it sharpened to a point, then heated the tip in sunlight, hardening the fibers. A primitive spear, light enough to carry, strong enough to pierce. She carved another into a digging tool, then another into a makeshift walking stick. It wasn't about fighting. It was about control, about refusing to be helpless, no matter how stripped down the circumstances. From a creosote bush, she collected resin, amber droplets that smelled sharp and medicinal. She warmed them in her palm until they softened, then smeared them along the joints of her cactus tools, sealing cracks, strengthening them. It stuck to her skin like glue. It reminded her of blood. She used some to coat small stones, embedding sharp flakes of flint into the resin. Now she had blades, primitive but sharp. And a soldier with even one sharp edge is never truly unarmed. When the sun reached its peak, she retreated to the shadow of a rock formation and closed her eyes. Sleep wouldn't come. Her mind refused silence. Memories moved through her like ghosts, Kine's voice steady and calm in the briefing room, Martinez's laugh during downtime, Washington humming quietly while reassembling his rifle. They were somewhere out there in that compound waiting, maybe hopping, maybe praying. Don't die here, she told herself. Don't give that lieutenant what he wants. A hot wind shifted, carrying dust across her face. The desert whispered like static. She whispered back, "You'll have to do better than this." At sunset, she began moving again. Her pace was steady, rhythmic, the same cadence she'd learned in selection during Hell Night, when you walked 30 miles on blistered feet just to prove to yourself you could. She learned back then that fatigue was just another form of deception, your brain telling your body to quit before it actually needed to. The trick was to stop listening. Hours passed. The desert changed again, from red-gold dusk to silver-blue night. She followed a faint trail, game prints, small and recent, that wound between low dunes and dry gullies. At one point she froze. A noise. Low, mechanical. She dropped flat, pressing into the sand, breath held. A truck. Headlights flicked across the horizon, maybe a kilometer north, moving slowly, probably a patrol. She stayed still until the sound faded completely. Then slowly she rose. They were searching. That meant they didn't believe she died yet. Good, let them keep looking in the wrong direction. By midnight, she'd reached a shallow ravine filled with the skeletal remains of mesquite and cholla cactus. She crouched low, eyes adjusting to the dark. The smell of diesel was faint but distinct now, carried by the wind. The compound was near. Zoe knelt, pulled a small handful of sand, and let it run through her fingers, feeling the direction of the breeze. Southeast to northwest. Perfect. The wind would carry her, sent away from the compound as she approached. She crept forward, staying in the troughs between dunes, every movement deliberate and silent. Her shadow moved like part of the terrain. When she reached a rocky outcropping, she climbed to the top and lay flat, scanning with naked eyes. The cartel base was clearer now. She could see the floodlights on towers, the vehicles parked in neat lines, the fence of corrugated metal and barbed wire. Inside, figures moved, silhouettes against the light. Guards. Dozens of them. Too many for direct assault. But Zoe wasn't thinking about attack. She was thinking about systems. And systems have weaknesses. She listened. Over the faint hum of the desert came a low, rhythmic thrum, mechanical, constant. A generator. Near the well. Their water supply. She smiled faintly. Every man needs water. Every outpost needs fuel. She didn't have bullets, but she didn't need them. The desert itself had given her something better. She pulled back into shadow and began planning. Step 1. Identify entry point. Step 2. Disable or disrupt without contact. Step 3. Use chaos as cover. She didn't know exactly how yet, but the idea was taking shape, like a faint line on a map she could almost see. That night she returned to a small canyon she'd passed earlier and began collecting. From the base of an old mesquite tree, she peeled bark fibers and twisted them into cord. From cactus spines, she fashioned small needles. From rock shards, she chipped flat edges sharp enough to cut. She even gathered the pale powder from certain desert blooms, pollen that, when concentrated, caused violent nausea if ingested. She didn't need to kill, she just needed to weaken. When dawn came, she was exhausted but alive. She found a cave halfway up a cliff face, sheltered from both sun and aerial visibility. She climbed inside and collapsed, chest heaving. For the first time since capture, her body demanded acknowledgement. Her hands were swollen from heat, her lips cracked and bleeding, her hair matted with dust and salt. Every movement sent knives of pain through her knees. But pain, she knew, was a message. It said, "You're still here." She lay there, staring at the cave ceiling, watching tiny motes of light shimmer through cracks in the rock. She could hear faint echoes of movement outside, maybe birds, maybe wind. In that strange, half-conscious haze between exhaustion and clarity, she thought of something Kine had said during selection. "Delta doesn't look for heroes," he told them. "We look for survivors. Heroes run toward danger. Survivors run through it and come out the other side still thinking." She smiled weakly. "Still thinking, sir," she whispered, "barely." Then she drifted into restless sleep. When she woke, the sun had already begun to drop. Her internal clock told her she'd been out for nearly 10 hours, too long. Her throat felt like sandpaper. She forced herself to sip the last of her collected water, then wiped her mouth with the back of her hand. Her pulse steadied. Mission time again. She crawled to the cave entrance, scanned the horizon. The compound lights were visible even in the fading day, small dots of white and orange against the deepening blue. She began her descent, moving low, silent. By full dark, she was within 2 kilometers of the outer perimeter. She could hear generators now close, loud, mechanical, and under that faint voices, Spanish, laughter, the crackle of a radio. She crept closer, finding a small ridge that gave her a view of the compound's western wall. A chain-link fence, topped with barbed wire, surrounded the whole facility. But something else caught her eye. Water drums, dozens of them, lined near the well, feeding into the compound's filtration system. She crouched lower, brain firing through possibilities. She didn't have poison, not in the traditional sense, but she had knowledge. The desert was full of plants that could cripple a man faster than a bullet if used right. She collected pollen, sap, resin, irritants that caused vomiting, dizziness, dehydration. If she introduced those into the water source. A small smile curved her cracked lips. The cartel thought the desert would kill her. She was about to let the desert fight back. She waited until midnight. Guards changed shifts, the compound's rhythm slowed, the generator masked sound. Zoe crawled through sand and shadow until she reached the fence. She used a sharp flint edge to slice through the bottom links, just enough for her body to slide under. The metal rasped faintly against her vest, but no one heard. She moved like smoke, low, controlled, invisible. At the well, she found the main water intake, a thick rubber hose feeding into the filtration unit. She unscrewed a valve and poured in her mixture, creosote resin softened with cactus alkaloids and pollen dust. Not lethal, but within hours it would make every man who drank from it violently ill. She sealed the valve, wiped the area clean, and retreated the way she came. By the time she reached the outer dunes, her heart was pounding so loud she could hear it in her ears. She dropped flat, breathing slow, watching the compound. Nothing, no alarms, no movement. Good. She rolled onto her back, staring up at the stars, endless, cold, indifferent. For the first time since being left to die, she allowed herself one small thought. You did it. But it wasn't pride she felt. It was something deeper, something quieter. Resolve. She wasn't out yet. She still had to go back in, find her team, get them home. The desert had taught her its first lesson, endurance. Its second lesson was coming next, patience. She closed her eyes, listening to the wind move across the sand. It sounded almost like applause. What happens when the hunter becomes the storm? By dawn, Zoe Brooks had become both. She lay on her stomach at the crest of a dune, watching the cartel compound through the haze of heat rising off the sand. The horizon shimmered like a mirage, but her vision was sharp, cold, and exact. The wind carried faint echoes from the compound, voices, engines, metal clanging. She could see men moving sluggishly, clutching their stomachs, staggering toward the shade. It had begun. The toxins she'd introduced into the water system were working exactly as intended. Non-lethal, but incapacitating. The human body was an engine, and she just cut its coolant line. By mid-morning, the place looked like a field hospital. Guards collapsed near vehicles. Voices shouted orders that no one could carry out. No one was watching the desert. That was their first mistake. Zoe crouched in the shallow trench she'd dug overnight, watching the chaos unfold. Her body was trembling from dehydration, but her mind was razor-sharp. She reached the stage of exhaustion where pain became background noise, a constant hum you simply learned to ignore. Her breathing slowed. She waited for the right moment. Then she moved. She stayed low, following the windward side of the dunes to mask her approach. Every few steps, she paused, listening. No engines, no shouts close by, just the steady hum of the generator and the faint moans of sick men. She reached the fence again and slid beneath the cut she'd made hours earlier. Inside, the air smelled of diesel, sweat, and sickness. Zoe's heart pounded, not from fear, but from purpose. Her team was inside. Somewhere in this maze of rusted metal, sun-bleached concrete, and chaos. She crossed the courtyard, moving like a shadow through corridors of noise and confusion. Two cartel guards stumbled out of a nearby building, both visibly weak. They barely noticed her slip behind them, hugging the wall. When they turned away, she moved past, silent, efficient, invisible. Her mind was calm, detached, every motion rehearsed 1,000 times in Delta scenarios. But this wasn't training. This was survival, weaponized. She remembered the compound layout from the satellite imagery. 3 main structures. The southernmost building, large, windowless, had reinforced doors. That's where hostages would be kept. She moved toward it, sticking to shadows. On the ground lay an assault rifle, an AK variant, dropped by a guard who'd likely run for shade. Zoe knelt, checked the magazine. Full. Her hands hesitated. It wasn't just a weapon, it was a lifeline. She took it. The weight was comforting, almost familiar, though the weapon's balance felt wrong compared to her M4. Still, it was better than a cactus spear. She slung it over her shoulder and pressed forward. At the entrance of the main building, 2 men sat slumped in plastic chairs, their rifles across their knees. Both were pale, sweating heavily. Zoe approached low and fast, grabbing the first man's rifle barrel and twisting it down while striking his throat with her forearm. The second barely reacted before she drove her knee into his ribs, then caught his chin with a swift elbow. Both fell without a sound. No glory, no anger, just necessity. She dragged their bodies into the shade, out of sight, then slipped through the door. The air inside was cooler. The hall smelled of disinfectant and concrete dust. A flickering light buzzed overhead. She listened. Somewhere deeper inside, voices, English. One of them was female. Zoe's pulse quickened. She followed the sound, weapon ready, stepping lightly over debris. At the end of the hall, an iron door slightly ajar. She peeked through. Inside, 4 figures sat bound to chairs. One looked up, gray hair, calm eyes. "Colonel Kine," she whispered. For a moment, neither moved. Then Kine's lips parted. "Zoe." She stepped in, closing the door behind her. Martinez gasped, eyes wide. Washington blinked like he was seeing a ghost. Zoe crossed the room in silence, pulled her sharpened stone blade from her belt, and cut through Kine's bindings. "How are you alive?" he whispered. She almost smiled. "Delta Force training, sir." "Where's your gear?" "Somewhere between here and 90 kilometers of bad ideas." She cut the others free. "We're leaving now." Washington rubbed his wrists, disbelief mixing with admiration. "You walked out of the desert, alone." "Walked, crawled, improvised. The details don't matter." Martinez's voice was hoarse. "What about the guards?" "Most of them won't be standing anytime soon," Zoe said. "I might have adjusted their water supply." "Adjusted," Kine repeated, raising an eyebrow. "Desert toxins, not lethal, but they'll be hugging toilets for 24 hours. Washington laughed, a dry, cracked sound. "You took down a cartel base with plants." Zoe shrugged. "Knowledge is a weapon, Sergeant." They moved fast, keeping low as they crossed the courtyard. The place was chaos. Men sprawled under shade cloths, some vomiting, others unconscious. A few lifted their heads but didn't react. Zoe led them to the motor pool. Rows of trucks, keys still in ignitions, doors open. They picked one that looked half-fueled. Kine climbed into the driver's seat, Martinez beside him. Zoe and Washington took the back. "North," Zoe said. "Borders 90 clicks." "Let's make it 50, Kine muttered, slamming the accelerator. The truck roared to life, spitting sand and gravel behind them. For a few seconds, Zoe didn't breathe. Then, as the compound disappeared behind a rise, she finally exhaled. They drove in silence, the desert stretching endlessly ahead. The sun climbed higher, burning the horizon to white. Kine spoke first. "You realize what you just did, Brooks?" Zoe looked out the window. "Survived. You weaponized the environment. No support, no comms, no extraction plan, and you still completed the mission." Zoe's tone was soft, almost detached. "The mission isn't done yet, sir. We're still in the desert." By noon, the truck's engine temperature warning light blinked. The heat was too much. Kine slowed, scanning for shelter. "Over there," Zoe pointed. A dry arroyo half hidden by mesquite. They parked under what little shade existed and let the engine cool. Martinez opened a canteen, took a sip, then passed it to Zoe. "You need this more than anyone." Zoe hesitated. Her lips were cracked, her throat screaming for moisture, but she took only one small swallow. "Ration it," she said quietly. "Desert doesn't forgive waste." Washington leaned against the truck, staring at her. "You're something else, Brooks. We thought you were gone." Zoe didn't look at him. "I was, then I decided not to be." They waited 2 hours before driving again. By dusk, the temperature dropped, the desert turning gold and purple under the fading light. In that quiet, Kine finally asked the question that had been burning behind his eyes since the moment he'd seen her. "How did you make it, Zoe, really?" She stared ahead, the horizon glowing like fire. "Training," she said at last. "And a lesson the desert taught me when I was a kid. Everything here wants to kill you, but it'll also save you if you pay attention. The difference is respect." Kine nodded slowly. "You're not wrong." As night fell, they reached the outer edge of U.S. territory. A small dirt airstrip waited, one arranged weeks ago as their extraction point. A single light plane sat there, engines idling. Morrison, same agent from El Paso, stood beside it, eyes wide as the truck rolled up. "My God," he said as they stepped out. "We thought you were all dead. Brooks, how did you?" She adapted, Kine interrupted, Delta style. They climbed aboard. As the plane lifted into the night, Zoe watched the desert recede beneath them. The endless expanse of sand and stone that had tried to kill her now looked peaceful from above. Infinite. Eternal. She didn't smile, she just stared. Because she knew something Morrison never would. The desert never loses. It just decides who's worthy to walk away. The debriefing lasted 3 days. Endless questions, endless note-taking. How did you survive without equipment? How did you identify safe water sources? What compounds did you use? Zoe answered each calmly, methodically, like she was back in a classroom. When one analyst asked, "Would you classify your water contamination tactic as chemical warfare?" she looked him dead in the eyes. "No," she said, "I'd classify it as education." When it was over, she stood in front of a mirror, wearing a fresh uniform for the first time in weeks. The reflection barely looked human, sunburned, lean, scarred, but alive. Alive because she'd refused to quit. As she buttoned her collar, she thought of the lieutenant's last words. "The desert will teach you humility." He'd been right. It had. But it had also taught her something deeper. That humility isn't surrender, it's awareness. The moment you stop believing you're stronger than the environment, you start surviving it. That night when she finally stepped outside into the cool desert wind of El Paso, she tilted her head back, staring at the stars again. The same stars that had guided her across the Sonoran wasteland, the same silence, the same faint hum of wind through sand. But this time it felt different. Not hostile, not empty, just honest. Because the desert doesn't care who you are. It only asks one question: will you keep moving? And Zoe Brooks had answered. She had moved. She had endured. She had become the storm. What happens after survival? No one teaches that part. They train you to endure, to fight, to keep breathing, but not how to live once the fight is over. For Zoe Brooks, the desert was over. But the silence followed her home. 3 weeks had passed since the extraction. The debriefings were complete, the reports filed, the analysts satisfied. The mission had been marked successful. All hostages recovered, no fatalities, 0 shots fired in the rescue phase. To the outside world, it was another classified operation in a war that didn't officially exist. To Zoe, it was something else entirely. It was proof and a scar. She stood alone in her quarters at Fort Bragg, staring at her reflection in the mirror. The woman looking back wasn't the same one who'd walked into the Sonoran desert. Her face was harder now, tanned, marked by fine lines at the corners of her eyes. Her hair, once dark brown, had sun-bleached streaks. Her body carried 10 new pounds of muscle and 20 new pounds of memory. She touched the faint scar at her temple, where the rifle butt had caught her. It wasn't the wound she remembered. It was the sound, that dull, final crack before the world went black. She turned away from the mirror and exhaled slowly. The room was quiet except for the hum of the air conditioner. It felt wrong, too sterile, too safe. She sat on the edge of the bed, elbows on her knees, head bowed. Her hands were steady, but her mind kept replaying the silence of the desert nights. That kind of silence didn't leave you. It stayed somewhere under your skin. When the official recognition came, she didn't expect it. A summons to Washington, a formal uniform, a stage, lights, photographers. They pinned the Distinguished Service Cross to her chest. The citation read, "For extraordinary ingenuity and tactical innovation, resulting in mission success under extreme conditions, and against overwhelming odds. Polished words for something no metal could really describe. Afterward, she stood outside the Pentagon steps in full dress uniform, the weight of the metal cold against her chest. The crowd had already moved on, reporters, generals, aides, all chasing the next story. Zoe stood there alone, the wind lifting her hair slightly. Recognition felt hollow. Not because she didn't value it, but because medals were for acts that ended. Her act hadn't ended, it had just changed shape. Later, in the debriefing building back at Bragg, Lieutenant Colonel Kine met her outside a closed conference room. He looked different too, older maybe, or simply carrying more of what he'd seen. "You holding up?" he asked. Zoe gave a tired smile, still here. He nodded toward the door. "They've been analyzing your report for weeks. You've got people in half the Pentagon talking about environmental weaponization tactics. They're calling it the Brooks Protocol." She huffed softly. "Sounds like a bad training video." "They're serious," Kine said. "They want to implement your methods into advanced survival courses across SOCOM. You've changed how they think about asymmetric warfare." She met his eyes. "All I did was survive." "Exactly," Kine said. "You survived when survival was supposed to be impossible. That's what scares them and what they admire." Inside the room, senior officers and analysts sat around a long table. Charts, diagrams, and still images from the mission decorated the walls. Zoe's name was on every file. She took her seat at the end of the table. A colonel she didn't recognize cleared his throat. "Staff Sergeant Brooks, first, let me say, what you did was remarkable, but we need clarity on one aspect." Zoe folded her hands. "Which aspect, sir?" "The use of naturally derived toxins in the water system. There's some debate as to whether that crosses the line into chemical warfare." She held his gaze, calm, controlled. "Sir, everything I used occurs naturally within the Sonoran Desert ecosystem. No synthetic compounds, no permanent harm. Every individual recovered within 24 hours. "Still," he pressed, "the intent was to incapacitate." "Yes, sir, as was theirs when they tied my team to chairs." The room went quiet. Then Kine, seated beside her, leaned forward. "What Sergeant Brooks did was textbook Delta doctrine: adapt, improvise, survive. You gave her nothing and she turned knowledge into a weapon. That's not violation. That's mastery." The colonel sighed, rubbing his temples. "No one's disputing the result. We just haven't seen anyone do it before." Zoe's tone softened. "Then maybe it's time you start teaching it." When the meeting ended, Kine caught up with her in the hallway. "You handled them better than I would have." She shrugged. "I wasn't trying to handle anyone, I just told the truth." He studied her for a long moment. "They're offering you a position. Instructor, Advanced Survival Training, Joint Operations Program. Australia's SAS and Canada's JTF-2 are involved. They want you to help build the curriculum." Zoe blinked. "Instructor." "Think about it," Kine said. "You've earned it, and maybe it's time you let the next generation learn what you already know." That night she sat alone in the barracks common area, the letter of reassignment in her hand. Teaching. It sounded like a different kind of mission. One without gunfire, without extraction points, without the hum of helicopters in the dark. But also without her team, without the field, without that singular focus of survive the next minute. She looked down at the letter again. Instructor, Joint Special Operations Survival Program. Somewhere deep inside, the desert's voice whispered again, that endless, wordless hum that had guided her through the nights. Maybe it was time to listen. 2 months later, Zoe stepped off a C-130 transport into the red sands of the Australian outback. The air was hot, dry, and smelled faintly of iron. Different desert, same silence. Waiting for her was a small group of operators, British SAS, Canadian JTF-2, and a handful of Delta candidates. All of them hard-eyed, all skeptical. Kine was there too, temporarily attached as an advisor. He greeted her with a grin. "Welcome to the end of the world." Zoe smirked faintly. "I've been farther." He nodded toward the students. "They know who you are. Word travels fast." She glanced at the group. Most stood stiffly, eyes narrow, like they were expecting a lecture. Instead, she dropped her pack and crouched in the dirt. "Before we start," she said quietly, "you need to understand one thing. The desert isn't your enemy. It's not trying to kill you. It doesn't care enough to try." The operators exchanged uncertain glances. Zoe drew a line in the red dust with her boot. "The desert is neutral, it reacts. If you respect it, it'll sustain you. If you fight it, it'll bury you. The same goes for combat, for leadership, for life." Silence. Then one of the SAS operators asked, "What about luck?" Zoe smiled. "Luck's just preparation waiting for a moment to matter." The training that followed was brutal, weeks under the Australian sun. Zoe taught them how to read landscapes, find water through wildlife behavior, use plants for medicine and camouflage, and create tools from natural materials. No high-tech gear, no shortcuts, just knowledge. At first, they struggled, even the seasoned ones. But Zoe watched as the lessons sank in, as understanding replaced frustration. One night, after a long day in the field, she sat by the campfire with Kine. The orange light flickered across his weathered face. "You've changed," he said quietly. "Everyone changes," she replied. "No," he said, "you're different, calmer." Zoe poked at the fire with a stick. "The desert took everything unnecessary from me. Noise, pride, fear. It burned it all away. What's left is what matters." Kine nodded slowly. "You know, they're calling your survival methods revolutionary. The Pentagon wants you to write a manual." She laughed softly. "A manual won't save anyone. Understanding will." Later that night, long after the camp went quiet, Zoe walked alone to a nearby ridge. The desert stretched endlessly under a silver moon. Different stars, same silence. She knelt, running her fingers through the sand, feeling its warmth fade into cool beneath the surface. This was her new battlefield, not against enemies, but against ignorance, against unpreparedness, against the illusion that equipment wins wars. She closed her eyes. The silence was total. And for the first time since that day in the Sonoran Desert, she felt peace. Not because she'd escaped the desert, but because she'd learned to understand it. Why do some people survive what should kill them, and others do? Zoe Brooks asked herself that every morning when the desert wind woke her. The Australian outback stretched around her like a living memory, endless red dust, flat horizons, and skis so wide they made you feel small. The silence here wasn't oppressive like the Sonoran. It was steady, almost patient. This desert didn't want to kill you. It wanted to teach you. By now, her reputation had become legend. The instructors called her the Ghost of Sonora. The recruits whispered about the operator who crossed 90 kilometers of hell with no water, no gear, and came back leading the mission herself. But Zoe didn't care about legend. Legends made people complacent. She cared about teaching reality. And reality, she knew, wasn't glamorous. It was sweat, pain, and knowledge paid for in blood. "Rule number 1, she said, standing before a circle of candidates under the scorching Australian sun. "Stop thinking toughness keeps you alive. It doesn't." The men and women around her were elite Delta, SAS, JTF-2, Polish GROM, all from the world's top-tier units. Yet even they looked uneasy under her gaze. She continued, "Toughness is a word people use when they don't know enough to plan better. Knowledge keeps you alive. Efficiency, awareness." She knelt, scooping a handful of red dust. "This," she let it trickle between her fingers, "kills the untrained. But it's also medicine, camouflage, insulation, and water indicator if you know what to look for. The difference is what's in here. She tapped her temple. A Canadian operator smirked. And if we just happen to forget what dirt is good for? Zoe's eyes lifted to him, calm, steady. Then you die in a place that doesn't even remember your name. The smirk vanished. Training days blurred together. Tracking lessons at dawn, hydration tests at noon, navigation drills at night. Zoe moved among them like part of the terrain, quiet, deliberate, never raising her voice. When someone made a mistake, she didn't scold. She made them repeat the process until they understood why it had gone wrong. Failure wasn't punishment here, it was education. One afternoon, during a heat endurance test, a young British operator collapsed halfway through the trek. His teammates rushed to help, but Zoe was already beside him, kneeling. His pulse was rapid, skin-hot, dry heat stroke. She shaded his head with her own hat, poured the last of her water onto a cloth, and pressed it against his chest. When he finally blinked awake, she said softly, "Tell me what you learned." He tried to speak, throat raw, "That I pushed too hard." Zoe shook her head. "No, you forgot to listen." He frowned weakly. The body tells you when it's failing. The environment tells you what's coming. You ignored both. She stood. Learn their language and they'll never betray you again. That evening, Kine arrived. He stepped out of a dust-covered jeep, his presence as solid as the landscape. The lines in his face were deeper now, the weight of command heavy in his eyes. Zoe approached, wiping sweat from her forehead. "Didn't expect you this far from civilization, sir." "Couldn't resist the heat," he said dryly, "and the company." They shared a faint smile, the kind that comes from surviving the same ghosts. He looked around at the training field. "You've built something here. Morrison called it revolutionary." "I'm just teaching people not to die stupid," she said simply. Kine chuckled. "You always had a way with subtlety." Then his tone changed. Lower, he handed her a classified file. She hesitated before taking it. "What's this?" "The man who left you in the desert," Kine said quietly. "The lieutenant. We got him." Zoe didn't move for a long moment. The desert wind shifted, tugging at the pages in her hand. "He's in custody." Kine nodded. "Joint Task Force picked him up near Nogales. He's been talking non-stop about the mission, about you." "What does he want?" "To understand how you lived." That night Zoe sat alone in her tent, the file open on her lap. The photo paper was grainy, a man in his 40s, gaunt, sun-worn face. The same grin she remembered, but now hollow, broken. His statement transcripts were worse. Page after page of confusion, obsession. "She should be dead. No one survives that heat. She's not human." Zoe read it twice, then closed the folder slowly. She stared into the darkness of the tent, listening to the hum of the generator outside, the occasional call of a night bird. She didn't feel hatred, not even satisfaction. Just understanding. He'd made the same mistake so many others did. He thought survival was about strength, about willpower, about dominating your environment. He never understood that real strength was the opposite. It was humility, the willingness to adapt, to listen, to learn. The next morning, Kine found her already awake, standing on a ridge watching the sunrise. "You read it," he said. "Yeah. And I don't need to see him," she said simply. Kine nodded. "That's probably wise." Zoe turned to him. "He'll spend years in a cell trying to understand how he failed. The truth is simple. He didn't fail. He just never learned what the desert teaches." "And what's that?" "That control is an illusion." Over the next weeks, Zoe's instruction took on a deeper tone. She still taught survival, but now there was something spiritual about it, not religious, but reflective. She started every session with a question. What are you afraid of losing? At first they gave standard answers, my life, my team, my mission. But she pushed harder. That's surface fear. I mean really. What are you afraid of losing when everything else is gone? It took time, but eventually they understood. The correct answer wasn't gear or safety. It was identity. People broke not because they ran out of water, but because they ran out of reason. So she taught them to build new ones. During one night navigation exercise, the stars stretched like silver fire across the sky. A Canadian operator asked quietly, "Staff Sergeant, when you were alone out there, what kept you from giving up?" Zoe didn't answer right away. She watched the stars, remembering how each one had been a promise she'd made to herself. One more kilometer, one more step, one more night. Finally, she said, because giving up would have made their cruelty the last truth I ever lived, and I wasn't willing to end my story on their terms. Silence fell over the group. Even the wind seemed to pause. A month later, Kine prepared to return to the States. Before he left, he found Zoe again, this time under the shade of a tent, reviewing maps. "You've done good work here," he said. "The program's expanding. SOCOM wants this model copied across every major training school. You've changed doctrine, Zoe." She looked up, one eyebrow raised. "Doctrine doesn't bleed in the sun, sir. People do. I just showed them how not to." He smiled, always humble. "Always realistic," she corrected. Kine hesitated. "One more thing. Morrison asked me to relay a message. The lieutenant's been transferred to a secure facility. He's asking to speak to you directly." Zoe sighed softly, still trying to understand. "Yes. What did you tell him?" Kine's expression softened. "That he wouldn't get an answer, because you already gave it to the world." She smiled faintly. "Good answer." He extended his hand. She took it, firm and steady. "Proud of you, Brooks," he said. "You turned a death sentence into a lesson plan." That night after Kine's departure, Zoe walked alone beyond the camp. The wind was soft, carrying the scent of eucalyptus and salt. The sky above the outback looked endless, a mirror of the one that had once watched her crawl across the Sonoran sands. She crouched and drew a line in the dust with her fingertip. 2 deserts, 2 lives. She realized then that survival had never been the point. Transformation had. The lieutenant thought leaving her in the desert would prove human limits. But all he'd done was expose what training and refusal could build. Zoe stood, brushing sand from her hands. Somewhere in a cell, that man was still asking the wrong question. How did she survive? He'd never understand the answer. Because the real question wasn't how. It was why. And the why had always been simple. Not vengeance, not pride. Just the quiet, stubborn truth that dignity doesn't scream. It endures. As she walked back toward the lights of camp, she heard the soft murmur of recruits still talking, still awake. They were comparing notes, arguing about technique, pushing themselves to learn. She smiled in the dark. That was her legacy now, not medals, not missions, but minds that would one day outthink death the same way she had. The desert had taken much from her, but in return it had given her purpose. And purpose, she realized, was the rarest form of survival of all. How do you know when you've truly healed? For Zoe Brooks, the answer came one morning in the Australian outback, not as a revelation but as a summons. The radio cracked to life just after dawn. "Brooks, report to Command Tent, priority message, eyes only." She set down her field journal, the one filled with notes from months of training sessions, and walked across the red dirt camp. The air was cool for once. Wind stirred faint trails of dust across the ground like ghosts rising to attention. Inside the command tent, 2 men waited, one Australian officer, one American liaison. The latter handed her a sealed folder. "Operation status, top secret. Location, Kalahari Desert, Southern Africa. Mission objective, joint reconnaissance and hostage extraction. Conditions, extreme heat, minimal visibility, low infrastructure. Zoe scanned the page silently. Different continent. Same kind of desert. The officer spoke. We're assembling a joint task unit, Delta, SAS, and South African Rexes. We want you on board as survival and field operations lead. She closed the folder. You have other operators qualified for that. Not like you. The words hung in the air. That night, she sat alone by the edge of camp, watching the firelight flicker against the endless horizon. The outback stretched around her, but her mind was already in Africa. The Kalahari. Different sand, same silence. She remembered the Sonoran like it was yesterday. The blistering heat, the hallucinations, the endless sound of her own breath in an empty world. She thought she'd buried that version of herself. But maybe the past doesn't bury easy. She reached into her pack and pulled out a small pouch of Sonoran sand, a keepsake she'd kept since returning home. She poured a little into her palm, let the red grains fall into the Australian dirt. Different deserts, same lesson. You never escape the place that remade you, you carry it. 2 weeks later, the team landed in Botswana. The heat hit like a hammer when they stepped off the transport plane, dense, dry, suffocating. Zoe felt her lungs tighten as the Kalahari's breath welcomed them. Briefings were quick, efficient. Hostile group, a militia fragment operating out of a network of dry salt basins. Objective, recover 2 humanitarian workers captured 3 days ago. Estimated survival window, 72 hours. Zoe reviewed satellite imagery under the flickering light of a generator. The terrain was brutal, sand flats, sparse vegetation, scattered ridges. No shade for miles. No rivers for hundreds of kilometers. It was the Sonoran all over again, but amplified. She exhaled through her teeth. Perfect. The team was small, 6 operators. 2 Delta, 2 SAS, 1 South African Recon and Zoe. The local liaison, Captain Mbele, briefed them at sunset. They're moving hostages constantly to avoid drone detection. We think they're hiding near the northern ridge of Deception Valley. You'll insert by land. 2 days in, 1 day out. Kine wasn't on this mission, but she could almost hear his voice in her head. Trust your preparation. Trust your map. The rest is instinct. The insertion began at dawn. The sky turned from violet to gold as their convoy of modified trucks rolled into the vast, shimmering nothing of the Kalahari. The desert stretched in all directions, flat and merciless. The temperature climbed fast, 100 degrees, then 110 degrees, the air shimmering like liquid. Zoe sat in the lead vehicle, scanning the horizon through sunglasses coated in dust. Every few kilometers she made small mental notes, wind direction, animal trails, shifts in vegetation. All tiny clues that meant everything when technology failed. And technology would fail here. The heat warped signals, fried circuits, drained batteries faster than any battlefield. Stay analog, she told the team. Use compass bearings, count steps, mark ridgelines. GPS won't save you out here. They nodded, trusting her tone even if they didn't fully grasp the desert's cruelty yet. By mid-afternoon, they'd reached a low ridge overlooking a sea of white sand. The heat was unbearable, waves of distortion rising from the ground like spirits dancing. Break, Zoe ordered. 5 minutes, minimal water. The South African operator, Mbele's man, gave a faint grin. You Americans always counting sips. Counting keeps you alive, Zoe said evenly, and alive people get to joke later. He laughed quietly. Fair point. That night as they camped beneath the stars, Zoe sat apart, writing in her journal by headlamp. Field note. Heat stress manageable. Terrain deceptive, flat appearance hides subtle elevation dips. Militia movement likely tethered to water sources. Focus on wells, animal convergence paths. She closed the notebook and looked up. The stars above the Kalahari were brighter than any she'd seen, each one sharp, clean, infinite. And yet, despite the beauty, she felt that same old pulse under her ribs, that quiet, dangerous energy that came before every turning point. The desert wasn't her enemy, but it was watching. On the second day, they found signs, tire tracks, footprints, a spent casing glinting under the sun. Fresh, Zoe said, crouching low. Less than 12 hours. Embele scanned the horizon. You think they're nearby? Close, Zoe said. Look. She pointed to a cluster of vultures circling to the west, not over a carcass, over movement. The team adjusted course, moving toward the ridgeline. By late afternoon, they found it, a half-buried outpost built from corrugated steel and desert rock. Smoke rose faintly from behind a dune. Zoe motioned for silence. They split into pairs, circling wide. Through binoculars, she saw 2 guards outside, rifles slung, posture relaxed. The rest, she guessed, were inside. She whispered into her comm, target confirmed, 2 outside, unknown inside. Recommend silent entry, limited contact. Copy that, said one of the SAS operators. Within minutes, the guards were down, tranquilized and dragged behind the dune. Zoe led the approach to the structure. The door was locked from inside, but the steel hinges were rusted. She pressed a knife into the joint, twisted slowly until the bolt cracked. They entered silently. Inside, 2 rooms, one filled with supplies, another with people. 2 hostages. Alive. Zoe cut their restraints, whispering, We're here to take you home. Tears welled in the woman's eyes. We thought. No time, Zoe said softly. Move. Extraction began just as the sun began to drop. The desert glowed blood-red, long shadows stretching like veins across the sand. They were halfway back to the vehicles when the first shots cracked through the air. Zoe spun, dropping low. Contact rear. Rounds kicked up sand around them. The team returned fire in short, controlled bursts. The militia had regrouped, 4, maybe 5 trucks barreling toward them. Cover fire, Zoe yelled. Bullets hissed past her head. The heat shimmered with dust and chaos. Embele called out, They're flanking left. Zoe scanned the terrain, then saw it. A depression ahead, a dry basin that could serve as cover. Move, she shouted. Basin ahead, go, go, go. The team sprinted through the sand, dragging the hostages. Zoe stayed rear guard, firing controlled bursts until her rifle clicked dry. They slid into the basin, taking cover behind rock fragments. Ammo check, she ordered. Low, came the answer from all sides. Zoe looked around, calculating distances, angles, terrain. She recognized the pattern. Outnumbered, outgunned, surrounded by emptiness. Just like before. But this time she wasn't alone. Listen up, she said calmly. We hold here until dark. The desert will cover us once the sun drops. They'll lose sight lines and the heat shimmer will break their optics. The others nodded, trusting her instinct. For an hour the firefight continued, bursts of sound, then silence, then movement again. Finally, as dusk bled into night, the militia fell back. The desert cooled fast, shadows deepening. Zoe took a long breath, her chest tight with exhaustion. The silence returned. Heavy, familiar. She leaned against the rock, looking at the stars that had once guided her through the Sonoran. Different place, same sky. Embele crouched beside her. You've done this before, haven't you? She gave a small, tired smile, once or twice. He studied her a moment. How do you stay calm when everything's falling apart? Zoe watched a faint meteor streak across the sky. You don't. You just stop expecting calm to matter. By dawn, the militia was gone. The desert had swallowed them like it swallowed everything else. The extraction convoy arrived by noon. The hostages were safe. The mission was complete. As the helicopters lifted off, Zoe looked down at the endless Kalahari, the sunlight glinting off salt basins and red dunes. It was beautiful and merciless, exactly how she remembered the Sonoran being. Back at the forward base, Mbele approached her as she was packing her gear. "You know," he said, "I heard the story, the Sonoran, the lieutenant, all of it." Zoe paused. "That's classified." He smiled faintly. "Deserts share secrets faster than governments." She looked at him, half smiling despite herself. He gestured toward the horizon. "You came back to the sand. Why?" Zoe thought for a long moment. Then she said, "To make sure it still scares me." Mbele frowned. "Why would you want that?" "Because fear keeps you awake," she said, "and awake people survive." He nodded slowly as if only half understanding, but he'd remember it later. They always did. That night, as she sat on the steps of the temporary operations hut, a letter arrived via encrypted tablet from Kine. Subject: "You did it again. Heard about Kalahari. Proud doesn't begin to cover it. The desert seems to follow you, Zoe. Or maybe you follow it." She stared at the message for a long time. Maybe he was right. Maybe the desert wasn't just a place she'd survived. Maybe it was a mirror. It reflected who she'd been, who she'd become, and who she still needed to be. And as the night wind swept over the dunes, carrying the scent of dust and distance, Zoe Brooks understood one final truth. Survival isn't something you escape. It's something you live with forever. What happens when the fight finally ends, but the silence does? Zoe Brooks asked herself that as the transport plane cut through the night sky above the Indian Ocean, heading home. The mission was over. The hostages were safe. The desert had spared her again. But she knew better. The desert doesn't spare anyone. It simply measures them and lets the ones who understand walk away. 3 weeks later, she was back in the United States. Fort Bragg hadn't changed, same barracks, same smell of gun oil and dust, but Zoe had. She walked through the compound like a ghost passing through her own past. Every corner carried an echo, the sound of laughter, drills, shouted commands, boots on concrete. She paused outside the old Delta training hall. The sun was rising behind it, casting a long shadow across the field. She stood there for a while, hands in her pockets, listening. Then a familiar voice spoke behind her. "You know, you don't have to keep haunting this place." She turned. Kine stood there, a coffee mug in hand, wearing that same tired half-smile she remembered from every deployment. "I'm not haunting it," she said quietly, "just remembering." He nodded. "Heard about Kalahari. Morrison says it'll be studied for years. You keep rewriting the rule book." She looked away. "Rules only work until the desert shows up." Kine chuckled softly, still the philosopher. Zoe shrugged. "The desert teaches better than people do." They sat on the steps, watching recruits begin morning drills across the field. Kine handed her a second mug. "You planning to stay on as an instructor?" "I don't know," she said honestly. "I thought I was done with the field, but every time I think I've left it behind, something pulls me back." "Maybe that's not the desert," he said. "Maybe it's purpose." Zoe studied the horizon, her eyes distant. Maybe those are the same thing. Later that day, she was called to a private meeting in the operations wing. The room was small, 2 chairs, 1 desk, a file folder waiting in the center. A brigadier general entered, shaking her hand. "Staff Sergeant Brooks, sit down." She obeyed, posture straight, expression neutral. The general opened the folder. "We've reviewed your actions across multiple theaters, Sonora, Outback, Kalahari. Your adaptability has saved lives, rewritten doctrine, and inspired interagency programs across NATO. The Joint Chiefs have authorized a transfer of role." Zoe raised an eyebrow. "Transfer?" He slid a single page toward her. Joint Special Operations Command, Advanced Human Resilience Division. Position Lead Instructor, rank promotion pending. Zoe blinked, Human Resilience. The general smiled. That's the official term for what you've been doing your entire career, teaching people not to die when everything collapses. She said nothing for a long moment. Then quietly, "Sir, may I suggest something?" He looked intrigued. "Go on." "Don't call it resilience. That word makes it sound like something you can buy. What we're teaching isn't resistance, it's respect." The general tilted his head, then nodded. "Noted." He stood and extended his hand. "Congratulations, Major Brooks." Zoe froze. "Major." "Effective immediately." She shook his hand, but there was no smile, only quiet astonishment. She had never chased rank. The rank had simply caught up. That night she walked outside the base perimeter, away from the noise and the lights. The field stretched into darkness, and above them, the same stars she'd once followed across the desert. She lay back in the grass, staring up, feeling the earth's cool pulse beneath her. For the first time in years, she felt something close to peace. She thought about the lieutenant, the one who had left her in the Sonoran. He was still alive, somewhere behind reinforced walls, still searching for the answer to how she'd survived. She wished she could tell him the truth. That survival wasn't strength, it wasn't defiance. It was acceptance. The desert doesn't reward pride. It rewards humility. The ability to kneel before something vast and uncaring, and still stand again afterward. Weeks passed. The new division was born quietly, a joint training program designed not around weaponry or tactics, but around the psychology of survival. Zoe led the first class herself. 30 elite operators stood before her, men and women from across the world. They expected another hardline course on grit, endurance, pain. Instead, she began with silence. For nearly a minute, she said nothing. She let the stillness settle, the kind of stillness that makes even soldiers uncomfortable. Then she spoke. "Everyone in this room knows how to fight, how to kill, how to survive an ambush, but that's not what saves you." She paused, scanning their faces. "What saves you is understanding what kind of silence you can live with." A murmur rippled through the group. Zoe continued, voice calm, deliberate. "When I was left in the desert, I thought survival meant staying alive. It doesn't. It means not letting what happens to you decide who you are afterward." She took a step closer, her tone softening. "The desert taught me that nature doesn't care about rank or courage or reputation. It cares only that you pay attention. The ones who listen walk out. The ones who fight it disappear." She stopped there, no dramatics, no hero story, just truth. One of the trainees raised a hand. "So what's the lesson, ma'am?" Zoe smiled faintly. "Simple, respect everything, even what wants to break you, especially that." Later, after the session ended, she lingered in the empty hall, the echo of her own words bouncing faintly off the walls. Kine appeared in the doorway. "Heard you made a few of them cry," he said. "Good," she replied softly. "Means they heard me." He walked over, hands in pockets. "You ever think about writing a book? The world could use what you've learned." Zoe gave a small laugh. "Maybe one day. For now, I'll settle for teaching people who actually listen." Kine nodded. Then he hesitated. "You know, I used to think Delta trained soldiers to be unstoppable, but watching you, I think it's the opposite." She tilted her head. "What do you mean?" He smiled faintly. "Delta teaches people how to stop, to slow down, think, adapt, learn. You just made everyone finally see it." She looked down, almost shyly. "Maybe that's all I ever did, slow down enough to listen." Months later, Zoe found herself standing in Arizona again. The Sonoran Desert stretched before her, endless and familiar. It had been years since she'd last stood on this ground. The same sand that had nearly killed her now looked peaceful. She walked slowly into the open expanse, boots crunching softly. The air was dry, the horizon a blur of heat and dust. She reached the place, or near it, where she'd first woken after being left for dead. There was nothing left, no footprints, no traces. The desert had erased it all. She crouched, ran her fingers through the sand and whispered, "I came back." A gust of wind answered, sweeping across the plain, tugging at her hair. For a long moment she just stood there, eyes closed, listening to that low, eternal hum, the sound she'd carried inside her for years. She realized then that the desert hadn't been her enemy. It had been her teacher, her mirror, her proof. As the sun began to set, painting the horizon in fire and gold, she turned toward the distance, where sky met sand, where everything ended and began again. Her voice was barely a whisper, but the desert heard it all the same. "You didn't break me," she said. "You built me." She stood there until the stars returned, one by one, patient, unwavering. Then she smiled just slightly. Because now she understood what Delta Force really taught, the lesson no manual, no briefing, no commander could ever put into words. That survival isn't about strength, or defiance or anger. It's about grace. It's about understanding your limits, and then forgiving yourself for having them. And sometimes dignity doesn't speak. It simply acts. Zoe Brooks walked back to her vehicle, the wind rising behind her like applause. In the rearview mirror, the desert stretched infinitely, shimmering under the dying light. It wasn't hostile anymore. It was home. And as the engine hummed and the horizon swallowed her silhouette, the desert whispered the same truth it always had. That the strongest ones are never the loudest. They're the ones who listen, who learn, who endure. End of story.